If people understand even basic tenets of Islam, it's impossible to be an extremist. So you can imagine my shock when 9/11 happened, and I'm like, what's this? They are very sinful, bad people who are saying they're Muslims. If a person says they're a Muslim, I can't deny that. That's between them and Allah.
Islam first entered my life through the form of terrorism. Are you safe from them?
They don't like what I do. Some of them may take it further.
Are you able to find criticisms of Muhammad's life that you think were not perfect?
That's a very good question. There's so much wisdom in the Quran and in many other hadiths, and they're ignoring that and they're going for the things that are weird and strange. I felt dirty. I felt I needed to go and have a shower and pray again because of what I'd witnessed in the mosque. I was horrified.
So does that make me a Muslim?
In a sense, yes.
How does Islam feel about people who leave Islam?
Well, I know what you're getting at.
Where are the Jews of Medina today?
Well, that's a good question.
Do you understand people being concerned that that might backfire?
It's an interesting perspective. I haven't really thought about it that way. No one's put it to me that way before.
I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti. Sheikh Paul Salahuddin Armstrong, thanks so much for being with me today. You didn't start out as a Muslim, but then you found Islam and are now an Imam. So can you tell me a little bit about what attracted you so much to Islam as an adult that was your journey?
One of the things which really drew my attention to Islam was the fact that in the Quran, the Ahl Kitab, the Jews and the Christians, are actually recognized that there are good people amongst them. God doesn't condemn Jews and Christians or people of other beliefs generally, or say that like this particular way of Islam that the Prophet's teaching is the only way, but says that there are good people amongst the Jews and the Christians, people who pray a lot, who give lots of charity, who are decent and honest people, and they have nothing to fear, neither shall they grieve. That spoke to me of a universal God who is for everybody. It's not something which is like a religion that's only for these particular people and everybody else is excluded, everybody else is going to hell. This kind of exclusivist approach to religion always I had a problem with, because obviously the God who created everyone, why would that God be so concerned by the labels? It would be more about like values, like justice, principles that we live by, the consciousness of God that we have. This is what that God would care about. It wouldn't be about particular labels or small group, or is this the right church or that the right church, when 99% of what they believe is the same. So this was actually what appealed to me about Islam. So you can imagine my shock when the following year 9/11 happened, and I'm like, what's this? This is like something very different from what I believed.
You came from a sort of traditional Church of England non-observant background in your family, from what I understand. And in your exploration, I presume you read the Bible as well and other texts from other religions. What particularly attracted you about the Quran and Islam?
I don't know why, to be honest, but the Quran spoke to me in a way that the Bible never did. Intriguingly, the Bible spoke to me more after I embraced Islam. And it's something I've always found strange, to be honest with you, because I couldn't really get into the Bible properly, even though I was familiar with like the stories of Moses and David and Jesus and these main stories in the Bible. But it just didn't really, when I actually sat down and was reading the Bible, it just didn't really speak to me. Whereas when I picked up the Quran, for some reason, it resonated with me. But then after I actually embraced Islam, something changed and I started reading the Bible more. And it was like the Quran was a key for me to understand the Bible better. And I actually, even like 7 years after I embraced Islam, I started buying books on Judaism. And one of the reasons was because the Quran constantly talks about Ya Bani Israel and referring back to them. And I was thinking, well, why is the Quran doing this, firstly? And secondly, what do I know about the people of Israel? I went to a Church of England middle school. When I went to school, I used to ask questions about the Jewish people and ask questions about, what if we follow Jesus? Because, we had RE classes, And if we follow Jesus, then why don't we follow Jesus' religion and what he believed? Why are people praying to Jesus? That didn't make sense to me when I was at school. So I was asking these questions, and the answers that I got from my teachers was that the people of Israel only existed to prepare the way for Jesus. And then when Jesus came, that's it. It's if they believe in Jesus or they don't believe in Jesus, that's the only thing that's important. That never made sense to me. And it's like so I didn't really know too much about the Jewish people until after I embraced Islam. And it was actually Islam that got me interested in learning about Judaism. And I started buying books by Rabbi Donim, for instance, who's quite an orthodox rabbi. And I was reading through those books, and I was amazed and astonished, actually. What I discovered was it's very close to what I believe was a Muslim. So much so, some years ago, I was actually asked by a friend of mine he's like one of my students as well, from a Kashmiri background. And he didn't really have the benefit of an education in his home country until he come to the UK. And he used to ask me all sorts of things about the Jews. And I said, okay, I'm going to read something to you. Just bear with me and read it and tell me what you think. And I actually didn't show him the cover of the book. I covered the cover of the book, How to Be a Jew by Rabbi Donim. And I was reading through it, but everywhere it says Jew, I replaced it with Muslim. Everywhere it had a quote from the Torah, I quickly remember something from the Quran or Hadith and read that instead. And he said, wow, he says, what book is this? This is an amazing book on Islam. Where can I get this? I showed him the cover. He's like, no way. I said, all I did was I just changed the word Jew to Muslim.
So your mention of 9/11 was interesting to me, because 9/11 was a big turning point in my life, as with many people, I think. If you saw Muslims carrying out acts like that in the name of Islam and the name of Allah, and you didn't like that, but you did like their text, the Quran, how do you explain the prevalence of extremism and terrorism and killing of infidels and non-Muslims by Muslims using that text? And how could you have felt an attraction to that if you were horrified as the rest of us by it?
It's a very fair question. I can understand. Well, I embraced Islam a year before 9/11. So it's like that happened afterwards. And I was investigating Islam as a religious path. And when I heard about terrorism and things on the news and stuff, I didn't really register so much they were Muslims. I just, the terrorists, they're bad people that are doing these things. After 9/11, of course, then it came into people's consciousness that there were these extremist movements within Muslim communities. And people started to investigate further. And of course, that affected me in my journey and what I ended up doing. I never sort of expected to go into dealing with that sort of thing when I embraced Islam initially. But it did cause me to investigate my religion a lot more deeply and to see where they're getting this from.
And where are they getting it from?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I can't deny there are certain verses in the Quran which they make reference to, and there are hadiths that they make reference to. But even then, if you look at the verses, they tend to reference from the Quran. And I was introduced to these within a year or two of embracing Islam by members of Al-Muhajirun and Hizb ut-Tahrir who tried to recruit me. And I went through the books that they gave me and gave them back. And I was highlighting, I says, have you read this verse in full? Have you read that verse in full? This is part of a verse. If you read the verse in full and the verse before and the verse after, it doesn't mean what you're saying it means.
But so how do you explain then the frequent, consistent association between Islamic scripture, even if they're misreading it, and their violence, their bloodthirstiness across so many societies? It's not just pockets of Islam. I mean, you mentioned 9/11, and for you it was an eye-opener that people were using Islam that way. But I mean, 9/11 wasn't the beginning of Islamic terrorism. There'd been plenty of suicide bombings in Israel. There'd been plenty of other attacks by Muslims using those very verses that you think they misunderstood. So how do you explain that connection?
Firstly, I want to point out, I mean, when I embraced Islam, I was 20.
Yeah.
So I was quite young and new to a lot of things. But the connection, but I hear what you're saying. I mean, this stuff goes back to the 60s and 70s, but I was a kid then, you know, so.
So you were unaware of it. 9/11 was kind of the moment where you first saw this book you fell in love with, that you connected with spiritually, being used that way. But obviously since then, I presume you noticed that it's frequently been used that way in some of the most horrific attacks on non-Muslims throughout modern history. So given that, I suppose what I'm asking is, why? Why is it so consistently misunderstood, if it's a misunderstanding?
It's deliberately misunderstood. These people use religion or the sort of like the guise of religion as a cloak for what they really want to do. They're about establishing totalitarian control and a form of fascism, which is, interestingly, it's deeply influenced by Nazism and also elements of Marxism as well. And then they sort of took things from the Quran or Hadith that they could actually play on the sensitivities and the upsets within Muslim communities of things within geopolitics which upset them. Where, countries were colonized or in the establishment of Israel. And they used this as like a crux to get people's attention and then reference things from religion as a way to engage them. It's not dissimilar to what the church did back in the time of the Crusades. I mean, Jesus said those who take the sword will die by the sword. He wasn't a violent person, but the Pope was actually encouraging people at that time to go and fight, against the Muslims, who at that time were quite peaceful actually in that region and were not really causing as much trouble as he was making out. But then he used that as a way to get them and then said, I will give you certificates to say you will go to heaven. He played on the religious sentiments of people in order to get them to fight. And this is exactly the same thing as what these extremists are doing. But upon closer analysis, it all starts to fall apart.
I've seen that you said, our first principle, we accept anyone who says they're Muslim. If that's the case, do you consider this sort of Salafist, Islamist, violent, extreme misinterpretation of Islamic text, of Islamic scripture, do you consider them Muslim?
I can't deny that. I mean, if a person says they're a Muslim, I can't deny that. That's between them and Allah. But at the same time, if they are doing things which are either criminal or worse, so violent and extremist, I condemn what they do. And I don't see that as a true reflection of Islam or how a Muslim should be. But like I said, I can't deny, if we say that they're not Muslims and play takfir on them, that's the game they play. I'm not going to get into that. And they are very sinful, bad people who are saying they're Muslims. Whether they actually have any faith or not, however misunderstood that may be, I can't look into their hearts and tell that. I don't know. But at the same time, I condemn what they do.
So if your aim is to build a sort of big tent of Islam and to welcome in all people who identify as Muslim, then how on earth can that work in terms of people like me? So as a Jew, I live in a world where I'm quite upfront about it. I'm terrified of Islam in many respects because Islam first entered my life through the form of terrorism. I first became aware of Islam with the burning of the Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie in the streets. My father was a publisher and a bookseller who had to keep it behind the counter in order to sell it to people who wanted to buy that book, but a believer in free speech. Offensive as it might have been to some Muslims, that to me was a baptism of fire. And similarly, 9/11 and all the terror attacks that I witnessed all through my youth and my adulthood have made me very aware that there is quite a high proportion of Muslims who don't feel and think about the faith as you do. And you're including them in your overall category of Islam. So what's the ratio? How many people are there like you and how many people are there like them in the worldwide Muslim population?
Well, there's something like 1.61 billion Muslims in the world. I mean, if there was really a significant portion of them worldwide that were like that, that would be it. The world would be finished. But the numbers of them that there are is clearly worrying. And the other problem that we have in Europe and in the UK is we have a higher proportion of people like that than what would be the balance in many other countries, especially within many predominantly Muslim countries. In many of those countries, they're not tolerated. They've had to run to this country and escape here, and they claim here asylum and human rights, which is really ironic and wrong when you think about it, because they're asking for their human rights here when they would very quickly deny everybody else's human rights, including mine and yours, if they were in power themselves. And this is why they're on the run. But then they set up offices in London, and other Western countries, and are doing their activities and promoting their poisons people
Are
here.
you safe from them?
I don't know.
Do you have to take precautions for your security?
I try not to ever think about it, but certainly there are people within that mindset that they don't like what I do. Some of them may take it further. Some of them will probably see me as more of a problem than you because I'm a Muslim and I'm speaking my mind on things and saying that I believe what they're doing is wrong. But I'm not going to stop because of that.
Am I right in thinking of Islam as a religion of conquest? Because, many of the countries that we today associate with being Muslim were once Christian. So you mentioned that there was this, you felt this hijacking of Christianity to fight against Islam. But was that not historically because of the conquest of certain countries by Islam? I'm thinking Lebanon, Egypt, but I mean, many places in the world were in fact conquered by Islam. And yet today, there is the sense, the popular cry from many Muslims and non-Muslims is that Israel, the Jewish state, is colonialist. Islam at its heart is quite colonialist, isn't it?
Um, I can understand why you would say that, and that's a fair point to make. But I don't see Islam itself as being so much the cause of that. But Islam was certainly used by empires in much the same way as other religions have been used by empires to sort of as a control mechanism. Let's be honest about it. That's not the way I see Islam, and I know there's a lot of Muslims who don't see it that way. Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia, for instance, which is one of the largest Muslim organizations in the world, does not approach Islam in that way. And of course, even though they are one of the largest countries in the world by population for Muslims, but they were never conquered by a Muslim army. And their population is more than many of the other predominantly Muslim countries combined. So it certainly is true in some places that Islam was used in that way. And they would have had people who would have been Mulanas or Grand Muftis and people like this that were paid in order to promote the interests of the state. And they used religion in that way, just like other countries paid bishops and whatever, to do that. It is something which I
So you
believe.
think it's unconnected to their faith, genuinely? Unconnected to their spiritual calling and beliefs?
I can't say that, but what I am saying is it doesn't have to be. People have used religion in that way, and Islam is not unique in that. But I don't believe that has any place in the modern world. And people of all religions today and other beliefs, not just even religious people, we have to push back against that because there's no future in that. I mean, all of our countries today, even predominantly Muslim countries, are not exclusively of that faith. And it doesn't create a healthy society when you are putting down every other faith. We're in a much better situation here in the UK, for instance, where it's not officially secular, but it effectively is, and people can believe what they want. They can go to their synagogue or church or mosque or gurdwara or mandir, and but shouldn't be an issue. That's a much healthier society than one where you have a state pushing down and saying you must believe like this, and if we don't see you in Friday prayers or Sunday prayers, then there's something really wrong. Are we going to start having a go at you about it, or persecuting you, or saying you committed a crime? This is wrong. This is crazy.
But if a state loses too much of its religious and cultural identity, doesn't it risk effectively being taken over by some people, practitioners of one faith or another, but I have one in mind, who are passionate believers in their version of their faith and willing to force others to adopt it or submit to it? And that's, to some extent, when it comes to violence and extremism within the UK. I reported from Manchester Arena after the Ariana Grande killings of little girls enjoying music. We've all seen the news over many years now of the Muslim rape gangs in this country. All of these people were acting in the name of your faith, and you say they're getting it wrong, they're misunderstanding the scripture, they're misunderstanding the religion. You wholeheartedly condemn them, which I'm really delighted to hear, and you and I both. But again, I'm asking you, what appealed to you about this faith, which is so commonly and frequently misused or hijacked, in your words, for those ends?
Well, I can tell you the way that I've learned my religion from Maulana Sheikh Nazim, Sheikh Isham Kabani, and Dr. Tariq Qadri, and teachers like this, it's nothing like that. So, I mean, I'm very comfortable with the way that I understand Islam, and these are traditional teachers of Islam. These are not people who are like new kinds of Islam that have been invented. This kind of Islam goes back centuries. But I hear what you're saying, and it is something that we have to be deeply concerned about, and it's something that we have to push back against. I mean, this is one of the reasons I wrote the foreword for a book by Harry Sulmarker.
I saw it just came out.
Yeah, and well, I'm very happy it's finally been published, because originally it was actually blocked by the first publisher. They actually refused to publish it, which I thought was outrageous. I mean, it again, it goes to the concerns that we both have about how people are being silenced that have important things to discuss. And we need to push back with our values as British people within this society. I still have those values as a Muslim. I haven't moved away from that. In fact, my Islam's actually reinforced them, because many of these things, such as standing up for justice and freedom and things, you can find this in the Quran. It's not something which is separate from them.
Well, how do you reconcile that? And you said I've heard you say that you're against the creation of the British Islam, specifically. So, given that that's the case, how do you reconcile what you just said with the ideas of British values on free speech or homosexuality, equality of women? These aren't things that most people traditionally associate with Islam. I mean, I don't know if your version of Islam is different. If your reading of Islam is welcoming of those people, does that mean, again, that your Islam falls completely in line with those British values?
There are always going to be some slight differences of opinion on things, you know. But the thing is, it's like when it comes to people's freedom and people's ability to do things, this is something which I can make an Islamic case for. It's not something which I regard as un-Islamic. You know, what people do is between them and Allah. You
Well,
know,
it's not when they kill other people.
oh, that's different. That's a crime that is actually, look, there's this principle, you know, if you're taking somebody else's rights within any system of law that has justice within it, you are taking from someone else. If you're taking their life, or you're taking their property, or you're harming them in any way, it's no longer a personal thing. It's the same, actually, even within Sharia. You know, if you do those things, it's no longer a personal thing. But if you have a glass of wine, that might be sinful within Islam, but it's your business. You're not affecting anybody by having a glass of wine. Somebody might want to have a conversation with you. Okay, that's fine, as long as they don't get nasty about it. But that's it. You know, it shouldn't be something which legally within the state you should be saying, no, you can't have a glass of wine. You know, it's a personal sin.
But
And there's a difference between these two things, you know.
well, in terms of that, I mean, it's Mosab Hassan Yousef has said to me that he found Islam unacceptable. He changed. He was the son of a Hamas founder and leader who then eventually informed on Hamas to the Israelis, saving countless lives by foiling terror attacks. But he rejected Islam as part of that journey because he felt that those people like you who interpreted Islam in a more peaceful way were actually not being honest to the original text. And he's certainly studied his Quran and in classical original Arabic. And his father was a religious leader. He said, if you call yourself Muslim in this peaceful mold that doesn't follow their teaching of the Quran, you're just a Muslim in name. How do you think he's wrong on that? And the other element of what he said that I think is important is he said, many religions have rules which might seem unreasonable or antiquated, but most of them restrict their rules to their own adherents, whereas Islam has a lot to say about people who are non-believers or the people of the book, that is us, the Jews. And whether we accept Islam, the Quran, Muhammad, or whether we don't. And there are, from my reading of the Quran, quite some horrible things in store for people who reject Islam. How is it Islam's place to have rules for them?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. But I mean, this individual, I'm aware of him, and I mean, he was from Hamas. And that is a particular narrative. I don't regard that narrative as being reflective of traditional Islam. But of course, he was raised with that. He was taught that, which is basically the Ikhwani teachings. It's more of a political ideology from what my understanding than a religion. But he understood that as Islam. That's what he was taught as Islam. So of course, when he rejected it, he's rejecting that. Well, I reject that as well. That's never been my Islam. But I can understand why, if that's what you're rejecting and that's what you're interpreting. And of course, he was only ever taught a certain narrative on those verses in Quran. So even when he read the Quran, he was reading it through that lens that he was taught. So some people do move away from that and they get a good teacher and they can distance themselves from that. But in many cases, people tend to reject everything because they only see it through that lens. They don't realize that there are other forms of Islam that are hundreds of years old where people are not interpreting it in those ways. And actually, this kind of Ikhwani approach is only, less than a couple of hundred years old. Wahhabism too is only a couple of hundred years old. I mean, these are not traditional Islam. Islam's a religion of 1400 years old. And the Prophet said, I never come to bring a new religion, that I'm reminding you of the teachings of the previous prophets going back to Abraham. So
And that's how you feel about Islam?
Yeah, that's how I feel about Islam.
So does that make me a Muslim?
In a sense, yes. Being authentic to your Judaism. I'm not suggesting you convert or anything. But there's actually the word Muslim itself, when it appears in the Quran, meant someone who was submitted to God. It didn't mean like people who were following the organized religion of Islam, because that actually didn't exist in the time of the Prophet. Like, it was just being taught.
So why does the Quran have so much to say about people who have submitted to God, who are monotheists, Jews, who don't then submit to the rest of Islam and the Quran? They are still believers in the one God, which you're saying, I presume, Allah is the same as Hashem, Adonai, Elohim, whatever we call him. But Islam, to my understanding, has never accepted Jews who reject Islam, has it?
Well, in Medina, the Prophet Muhammad actually made a covenant with them. He actually made a constitution where he said that you have your religion and we have our religion, and we are one ummah.
But he also killed quite a lot of them and married Sophia, no?
This came about afterwards, and it is easy to read it in that way, and I can understand that. But at the same time, and I'm not saying they weren't Jewish and these people weren't Muslims, but there was a number of different tribes. Those that actually kept to the original agreement they made in the constitution, they didn't have this problem. It was more of a tribal conflict between so many different tribes that were there in that time. So it's true what you're saying in regards to those tribes, and I understand that. And it is troubling reading when you read that now and what happened. But I mean, we must remember as well, we were talking about 1400 years ago. I mean, if you go back even 500 years ago, we had King Henry VIII here, and
it is, but there are
he had 6 wives, and it's
for sure he had them one at a time to be accurate. In fact, he changed his religion so that he could, more or less. But the point is that,
and that was only 500 years ago. So I mean,
granted,
go back to 1400 years ago.
18 months ago, I watched lots of videos of people bursting over a border doing pretty similar things to what my reading of those warriors of Muhammad was: raping, murdering, kidnapping Jews. And they said it in the videos I watched from October. Yeah, I mean, we've seen these videos that Allahu Akbar, God, God is great. This is for the nation of jihad. Even if 1,000, 2,000 die, this is for the nation of Islam, of jihad. So I agree with you. Maybe I could put it behind us if it was just Sophia Yahudiya who gets raped in the name of religion. But it's not. It happened to me, the son of a Holocaust survivor. I watched my people in their country, Israel, being literally murdered and raped by people who said exactly the same sorts of things based on the same scriptures. So of course, I'm not trying to pick this fight with you. You've told me you don't support that. You reject it wholeheartedly and you think it's a misreading of the text. But I keep going back to this. Lots of people seem to misread the text that way.
I agree with you. I understand where you're coming from, and it's a valid observation. It's an important one. We can't ignore that. We have to deal with that as societies and not allow that to happen.
It must be very frustrating for you then, because I understand what you're saying. Not to give you a hard time, I'm trying to give these notions of Islam that many of us find scary or threatening a hard time. And you are telling me, as far as I understand it,
I
you
want to give
also
them a hard time as well, yeah.
right. But given that that's the case, you can't deny that Islamic terrorism is a major threat to the Western world today, can you?
I don't deny it. In fact, I speak about it myself and condemn this and try and raise awareness that we need to deal with that as a society and not allow radicalization to take place that causes people to turn out like it. Any kind, regardless of any religion. But I recognize at the moment, obviously, within Muslim communities, it is a particular problem.
And what's the next step then? Because I would love your readings and versions and teachings to be adopted in a mainstream way so that I'm no longer afraid of those things I mentioned and so that I no longer see them. But I can't see that happening in my lifetime or yours. I'm not sure if it could ever happen. And even if, as you say, it's a minority who subscribe to this form of extremism and terrorism, and I'm not sure how we know that, if it is a minority, but let's say it is, a minority can do a lot of damage and does.
Yeah.
So the frustration for you, as somebody that believes you're a classic Muslim, I think is how you described it to me, their abuse, as you would say it, of your faith for such horrific ends must be enormous. What are you able to do in order to make your version mainstream and accepted and their version powerless and rejected?
Well, I speak out against it, and I do podcasts weekly. I wrote a foreword for a book to try and get people to think and recognize the issues that we're facing. And I will keep doing things like this, and also engaging with people that are on my wavelength and understand religion in the way I do, both within Islam and also within wider society, to actually push back against this. I mean, I'm also heartened. I mean, while these things happen, and however terrible and appalling they were, I'm also heartened by the fact that the Abraham Accords have lasted through this period, and that all the signatories to that have actually stuck to their agreement. And this, I see, in many ways, it's a modern day manifestation of those principles in the Constitution of Medina. These are the signatories from the UAE and Bahrain and other countries. They are also Muslims. And they signed on to it because they recognize that we all come from the common heritage of Abraham. And, those teachings which unite us, those principles and values. And, so we can't get away from the fact that there are people abusing the faith and are being violent and appalling in their whole approach to Islam. But at the same time, if that really was the true reflection of Islam, you wouldn't have the Abraham Accords. It just wouldn't exist. And it certainly wouldn't have lasted through this whole period of the recent conflict between Israel and Gaza.
My understanding in Islam is that Muhammad is considered to be an exemplar, the ideal man. And am I right in that understanding?
Yeah, that's a fair comment. Yeah.
So are you able, as a thinking intellectual Muslim, to find criticisms of Muhammad's life that you think were not perfect?
That's a very good question. On the intellectual level, I listen to things and I analyze them and I reflect on them. There are things attributed to Muhammad that I doubt,
Such as?
so certain hadiths, such as things around camel urine and stuff, that I find it actually disrespectful to associate that with Muhammad. I'm not sure he ever said such things.
Child marriage?
Well, I don't even think that actually happened. I think Aisha was much older when she got married to the Prophet, and there are many accounts that actually attest to that. And, it's based upon this one particular hadith where it says that she was 9 years old. But the thing is, actually, if you add everything else up on instances in Aisha's life, one can make a strong case that that is actually a da'if hadith, that is not accurate.
How old would she be by the other calculation?
Probably somewhere between 16 and 19. Which, yeah, is young by today's standards, but even in many countries today, it would be legal, if not conventional, but it would be legal.
So you don't believe that Muhammad married a 9-year-old?
No, I don't.
And you
And
believe...
I'm not alone in that. There are actually quite a lot of Muslims that don't believe that.
And would you go so far as to say that it would have been wrong, even in that era, to marry a 9-year-old?
I think it would have been quite surprising and shocking, to be honest, in many societies, and even back
Right.
then, yeah. Obviously, I mean,
Okay, but so the reason I'm pushing you on it is because there'll be Muslims watching this potentially who'll say, here is an Imam who said it would be wrong if Muhammad married a 9-year-old, and I believe Muhammad married a 9-year-old because of that hadith, right? That would be their thinking. And at that point, what happens to you?
well, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, like I said, some people won't like, what I say, but the thing is, I don't want to please people who have such a crazy mindset that they find the weirdest hadith that are questionable, and then basing their religion on that, when there's so many, there's so much wisdom in the Quran and in many other hadith that makes sense, and they're ignoring that and they're going for the things that are weird and strange. That says a lot more about them than it says about me, and that's something for them to address.
So one of the reasons I really wanted us to have this conversation and to meet is that you speak very warmly about Jews. And I wonder how typical you find that among British Muslims.
Among British Muslims, I know many Muslims that are, have warm of, understanding about Jews, but yeah, there are also, like we already discussed, there's a lot more extremists as a percentage within this society than what there should be within the Muslim communities. And obviously they have a very different perspective. Um, but I'm by no means alone, in that.
Do you think that your spiritual reading of the Quran then is at odds with political activism around Palestinians and Zionism?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's certainly within some elements that are basically Hamas supporters, and they're unapologetically supporting Hamas and thinking that's the best way forward for Palestinians. I'm pro-Palestinian people. I support the Palestinian people, and I want them to have a future that's a good future. Even President Trump said it, in Saudi Arabia. It's, just a few days ago. The thing is,
Who do you mean by Palestinian people?
the people, the ordinary people in Gaza and West Bank, the people that are not out to kill Jews, they just want to have a life. They want to live there on their historical land and have a future. But the thing is, there's a big problem with the fact that the leadership has been hijacked by groups like Hamas. Obviously, how can you have a future with people who want to kill you? And even not just that, there was a fatwa that I actually promoted even before, the incident on October the 7th, a couple of years ago, where this fatwa was actually against Hamas. It was written by Islamic scholars because of the way they treat Palestinians. There's a very strong case that they should not be in leadership because, I mean, they kill Palestinians.
They have, but how much did that fatwa help?
Yeah. It's a fatwa is a religious opinion of religious scholars. But the thing is, you need implementation. It's like people ask me in this country, what are you doing like to police your community? I ask, but what do we have a police force for? If people are committing crimes, they should be arrested for those crimes.
So when I see imams in this country preach death to Jews, destroy their homes on Friday prayers inside mosques, which I have seen videos of, and we're told then by the police that the threshold for crime was not reached. Obviously, from the sounds of it, you disagree with them on that. The threshold for
I don't think anybody should be preaching, death to anybody in a Friday sermon. I mean, I remember some years ago, I went to a mosque in Birmingham for my Friday press. And I went there because I was told the Imam was a good Imam and he does speeches in English. So I thought, okay, I'll go along. I went to this mosque and he was preaching everybody in Israel, every Jew in Israel is a target. You can imagine how sick to my stomach I felt. I didn't feel like I prayed. I felt dirty. I felt I needed to go and have a shower and pray again because of what I'd witnessed in the mosque. I was horrified. There's no place for that in any place of worship. When I go to pray because I want to get closer to God. I want to, reflect on myself and how I'm living my life and be, is the things that I've done wrong? Is the things I can improve upon? How can I be a better human being? How can I be a better servant of God? I do not want to hear such things in the mosque. It's quite frightening that is allowed. And in fact, there are many Muslim countries, they wouldn't tolerate that. these people would be removed. They'd actually be,
Well, they have to
arrested.
submit the Friday sermon on Wednesday, then it's checked, and then it can be controlled in the. They have people listening and watching to make sure it is as it was submitted. So, would you be supportive of doing that in this country, given that there is a problem?
Well, given that there is a problem, I think that there should be a system in place where, and let's generalize it, all ministers of religion, should to a certain standard.
Yes, but okay. But when we talk
And
about regulation, why do all ministers of religion have to submit to something because of a problem inherent in a lot of Islam? That to me, it's the
I can understand.
that's the thing where we all have to take our shoes up at the airport.
Would it be right for another, like a pastor or someone, to be saying such things as
Of course not.
And that's the point I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, if they're not doing it, then it doesn't even affect them.
But you would support, for example, police going into mosques, arresting imams who made those sorts of sermons?
Yeah, I mean, it needs to be stopped. This is not acceptable.
What do you think Britain is getting wrong then? You mentioned that in some Muslim majority and Muslim-ruled countries, they are policing this better. Do you think we're getting it completely wrong then in the United Kingdom?
The problem is there's the total lack of regulation on this within this country. Why?
Well, freedom of worship, freedom of belief, freedom of speech, right?
But nobody's stopping people from praying. Even if you have this regulation in place, I'm suggesting, we only want to stop hateful preaching. It's not stopping Muslims from praying.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, a lot of Muslims would prefer if they weren't listening to that on a Friday sermon,
I'm really fascinated by the fact that you read the Quran, from my understanding, as a non-Muslim at the time, or not a practicing Muslim. I don't know if you believe that you were always a Muslim and you somehow rejoined.
That's also an interesting question. I didn't used to think that, but there's certain things that have happened since that made me think, when wasn't I a Muslim?
Okay.
Because my concept of God and stuff, it's always been along the lines that Muslims, also Jews, had the same concept of the oneness of God, and
I think we invented it more or less. Well, so they say. But I think I'm interested by it because I read the Quran. It's a funny story in some respects. I used to do voiceovers as a sideline in my work, and I got hired to do an audiobook recording of a new modern English translation of the Quran. I'm not sure they Googled my name before they hired me. And I recorded the whole job all the way through, spent many, many hours on it and submitting it constantly to the Imam and his son who had done the work, corrections, changes. To all intents and purposes, they were very happy with it. And then at the last minute, I think they did Google me and it got re-recorded. But that story aside, I was very grateful because it gave me an opportunity to read the Quran, which I had not read before. And I did it from a position of absolutely trying to do it justice. I had been hired to be the voice of the Quran for believers and non-believers who wanted to hear it in modern plain English. I was not in love with what I read, especially when it spoke about my people. What was I missing?
Depends which parts. I can understand there are certainly criticisms in the Quran. For instance, it mentions people who wrote the book with their own hands, or other criticisms of people that they're not following what they were given. But from my reading of this, I mean, bearing in mind this is an Abrahamic book, there are things in the Bible talking about, I mean, even Moses himself called the people of Israel a stiff-necked people. They're Jewish criticisms of Jews who are not practicing what they're being given. That's how I read it. That's how I understand it. I wasn't so surprised by it because I was familiar with some of this stuff from the Bible beforehand. But the Quran also clearly states that there are good people amongst the Jews and the Christians.
So you're comparing the Quran and the Torah in their levels of violence or aggression or punishment?
Well, actually, I think if you do that, then the Quran actually doesn't come out so bad. I mean, there are some verses in the Bible that are quite violent. I mean, people aren't always aware of them. Don't really want to go into that, but it's.
But the difference is, of course, that Islam wants actively to convert people, and Judaism discourages conversion entirely, right? So part of your mission as an imam is to spread, presumably, the beauty and love and understanding of Islam that you have, to the extent that you believe even that proto-Muslims, i.e. Christians and Jews, are even version 1.0 and 2.0 of the version 3.0, which is Islam, right?
Maybe at one point I may have thought, like, I don't really think there's that so much now. I mean, I'm more like, if I've seen people who are, I've met people, I know people who are rabbis, who are priests, who are very deep in their understanding of their religion. I see a parallelism in where they are in their understanding. I mean, they don't need to convert to Islam to be any better human being or any closer to
You
God.
consider them good Muslims already?
I consider them good Christians and good Jews and people of God. I mean, it's, for me, it's,
So what will happen to them, for example, in the afterlife?
well, like I said, that there is actually a very clear verse in the Quran where it said that among the Ahl Kitab are people, amongst the people of the book, are people who are good people who have nothing to fear, neither shall they grieve. The very fact that it's worded that way, nothing to fear, neither shall they grieve, that to me indicates they're not going to hell. Because, come on, if you're going to go to a burning fire, then clearly you have every reason to fear and every reason to grieve. So the fact that God says this about them, that if they're good Jews and Christians, if they're people who are sincere and decent people, they have nothing to fear. So I don't feel the need to convert them. In fact, I would be scared that I might confuse them. You know, if somebody's like really true to their faith and they're a good person and they're practicing it, I wouldn't want to confuse them. I wouldn't want to take that from them.
So is Islam not an evangelical or it's not a religion that it wants to welcome people to it who
Of
aren't
course,
Muslims?
people are welcome, but the thing is, the way I see that is, it's welcome to those who want it. If somebody's comfortable where they are and they're happy where they're, why would I want to disturb that? You know, I want to have good relations with them. I wouldn't want to, you know, like proselytize. To be honest with you, I've never liked people who proselytize. You know, it's something I've always had, even like when I walk down the street and I hear people, regardless of their religion, if they're like speaking on a microphone and, yeah, I'm not out there with my family and I want to go and have coffee or something, the last thing I want to hear is that.
How do you feel about people who leave Islam?
I can understand. You know, I've spoken to some of them. I've actually reached out to people who are ex-Muslims and had conversations, and I can see some of them are traumatized by their experiences. Now, of course, if you come from a community where you're traumatized and you have these experiences, um, I can understand why people would leave that, you know, but I don't hold it against them, but I feel sorry that they've had to go through everything that they've been through. It troubles me deeply. But,
Well, let me rephrase that. How does Islam feel about people who leave Islam?
well, I know what you're getting at because there's a verse in the Quran, but the thing is that verse in the Quran, the way I've had it explained to me by my sheikhs and the way I understand it, is this was because it was more of a case of people in the time of the Prophet, very contextualized, people who came into the community to say they were Muslims and then did things like to undermine and to cause trouble and then left. And these were people, it was more about treason than it was about people leaving a faith and a belief system. So it's like, I can understand why the Quran says that, but at the same time, I don't believe that applies to people today that come from a traumatic background where they've left it.
Okay, but does it apply to people who today leave and try to be treasonous as Islam might see them?
This is not my place to say that. It's you're an Imam. It's between them and Allah. I mean, this is the way I see it, and I'm not going to get into it any more than that.
Who gave you your first Quran?
That's interesting. It was actually an Islam awareness store in Wolverhampton going back many years ago. And I actually went up, I mean, I was, 18, 19? And I went up there with a friend of mine from university. I saw these stories of God, Muhammad, Jesus and stuff on it. And I wasn't religious at the time. So I went up and we went up to have a laugh, I'll be honest with you. But I quickly said to my friend after, you know, we were bantering a bit, and I said, no, leave it. These guys, nice guys. And they were genuinely. And they offered us a free English translation of the Quran, leaflets and stuff, and says if you have any questions. And whatever we asked them, even if it was cheeky, they were responding in a very nice, friendly, and, you know, they were taking it. And I said to my friend, leave them alone, you know, they're okay.
What do you think they were hoping to convert people like you?
Well, obviously, you don't stick a stall in the middle of town and with, you know, God, Jesus, and Muhammad on it unless you're trying to at least raise awareness of your religion. I mean, And yeah, I think as a part of that, they were hoping people would become Muslim. And maybe in my case, yeah, maybe they were successful in a way. But actually, I mean, I drifted away from Islam after that point because I met some of the Muslims I didn't like. One thing you might not realize is Islam was the first religion I crossed off the list of religions that I wanted to be. And I was looking at everything else. But during this time, I kept reading the Quran. And it was the Quran that actually drew me to Islam. Um, I don't know why you didn't see what I saw in the Quran, but
you know what?
certainly what I read from it, it helped me. And
all the stuff about hellfire and in hell you're gonna have your skin boiled off, and Allah knows what you really think, even if you say you're a believer but you don't really believe inside. I mean, there's some really horrible stuff in there that really sounds terrifying. And so I could understand how a sort of 7th century desert tribe might find that this is a useful book to impose some new ethics and morals that will work in their society to, let's say, civilize their behavior from the more primitive version. I'm using lots of words which should get me in trouble, but that it might be a code of conduct that would have worked then, with a lot of promises of, rivers below your feet and fruits and endless sex in the afterlife if you get it right. But all of those things, to me today, as a 21st century Westerner and as a Jew, I mean, I've got most of them available at my fingertips. It's not hard for me to go and find fruits and water, and probably even easy to find sex these days. So my point is, I don't really get why. And then that was the carrot. The stick was really horrific punishments from God for what seemed like the smallest of things, like doubting in this belief system, even internally, silently inside your head. Tell me what I missed, honestly, genuinely, because you found it beautiful and I found it terrifying.
We're all individual. I don't know. I mean, it's parts of my journey, and that's not how I read the Quran. There's many things in the Quran that I see that are tremendously wise and helpful. And the fact that Islam, one thing that really appealed to me is the fact that Islam places the responsibility on you and me, on ourselves as individuals. It's between us and God, our journey. We're not relying on a sacrificial person or lamb or something like this, that it is about us. We have to step up. We have to sort ourselves out and be the best kind of human beings we can be. I can certainly understand the imagery around hellfire and stuff, that it is quite shocking and stuff. But then again, I grew up within a sort of Christian environment, so it's not so strange for me. I think within Judaism, it's slightly different with regards. There isn't really a hellfire, is there? It's a bit different.
Is it okay that I say those things about my response to the Quran with you?
I don't have a problem with it because it's authentic. It's what
I don't say it to offend. That's my point. I really don't want to offend. But you asked why my reaction was as it was, and I'm curious why yours was as it was. And you said because you identified beauty and truth and spirituality, and it helped you to understand Jesus and the former scriptures of the Old and New Testament. So I hear that, but I am curious when I hear people in your position.
I just quite understand it. Yeah.
So I didn't mean to offend you. If that, I hope I didn't.
It.
Okay, good. And I do think that these conversations are really important to me anyway, and I hope that to people watching, because I think it's through discussing our honest responses that we can hopefully understand one another, and also, where appropriate, be less afraid of one another. So I think that is important. If I can steer us slightly towards different subject, afraid it's not necessarily any easier, but it's Israel. Have you been to Israel?
Not as yet, no.
Would you like to?
Be a good idea to visit at some point. I mean, there's holy places for us in Israel that I would love to visit, like Masjid al-Aqsa and the Tomb of the Patriarchs and King David's tomb as well. I mean, I would really like to visit those places at some point because it's important to my faith.
And you're very, as I said, you do preach genuinely. It's why I wanted to talk with you. You preach a message of peaceful coexistence with Jews, and you also earlier expressed that you have a very concerned humanitarian attitude towards Palestinians. And so the current conflict which is going on must be one that is difficult for you to negotiate, both internally and presumably externally to your community. Can you give me, it's a broad question, but deliberately so, can you give me a bit of an outline of how you see the situation between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs, and Israel and its other Arab neighbors who often use Islam as a justification for terrorism and attacks on Jews and others living in Israel?
Well, it's a very complicated and nuanced thing to discuss. I mean, there's many different aspects to this. Obviously, you're Jewish, and obviously, I guess, very concerned about the Israeli side, because I've seen how you've discussed about Israel in the past. I mean, Israel itself is in a difficult situation. Obviously, primary thing for the Israelis, they have to consider their security, the security of their people. And for any state, that is something of paramount importance. And then you also have the Palestinian communities there, and those communities, they have a right as well to live in peace and to have security and have a good future. And I want to see them have that, but they need to have the right leadership and need to build something that's peaceful and towards business and coexisting. Like I mentioned, the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords is about the countries in the Middle East working together and building a future together and doing business with each other. There's no reason why, if this extremism and violence can be stopped, and that the Palestinian community can't have a state there alongside Israel and do business with the Israelis and maybe get very prosperous and successful as well. I would love them to have that future, but at the same time, I also do understand how it's very difficult to negotiate that with the way things are at the moment. I want everybody to be able to live in peace and security and be able to do business with each other and live together peacefully. I like that's the future I think we should all want and should be working towards. But obviously, I mean, if there are people, and we know there are, and even if not just Muslims who have some very negative views as well, and are teaching things that are not good or constructive. This is a problem, and this needs to be addressed.
I, of course, have on a human level an enormous sympathy for anybody caught up on any side of a war when there's suffering and hardship. I think the bit that I struggle with in terms of the idea of Palestinian self-determination or statehood is the bit that you just added quite rightly as a sort of precondition, which is peaceful coexistence and end to violence and extremism. Where it comes into this conversation, I think, between us is the justification of some of those things, again, through Islam. It seems to me like the birth of the idea of a Palestinian people as opposed to Arab inhabitants of that area of land, the identity of Palestinianism is somewhat related to Islam. And again, an idea of conquest, that the very most offensive thing about the state of Israel is that this is a piece of land that should be Islamic land being ruled by Jews. Is that a misunderstanding?
No, I understand where you're coming from according to the current political milieu, but at the same time, I'm also aware historically there were Jewish grand wazirs, which is effectively prime ministers in many Muslim states. So there shouldn't be really within Islam a problem as to why Jews can't have their own states and be successful. The other thing is, I mean, as I have quite clearly stated on a number of occasions, that Israel has existed for the past 75 years. Anybody who doesn't recognize that is anti-Islam. That was 77 years, of course. But it's a couple of years ago. But it's it's a long time. It exists. It's a well-established state. It is built. It's going nowhere. The thing is, what troubles me is the fact that within that period of time that the Palestinians haven't been able to build at least something similar, or something similar to the Arab neighbors. And there's clearly a crisis of leadership on their part that needs to be addressed. And as long as, I mean, you think as well, the amount of money that's actually gone into the Palestinian organization and also into Gaza, and then you see rockets being fired, tunnels that are under the ground. Where is this money being invested? I mean, it is really deeply troubling for me as a Muslim because obviously, I mean, if I was running it, I would not be investing in those things. I'd be investing in the infrastructure that people need to ensure that they can have a prosperous future. I'd be looking at how we can do business arrangements, both with the Israelis and also with other neighbors, so that we can actually move forward as a society. But
But
then when
that's
you look at the educational system in Gaza, especially, the things that were being taught is horrific and things which shouldn't be taught. I mean, if you're teaching children from a very early age that every Jew is their enemy and that they should, look, I have children, I couldn't conceive teaching this to children. Why on earth would anyone teach that to children? You know, it, there's no future with that.
Do you expect your children to live into adulthood as Muslims?
I believe every single person, including my children, has to navigate their own spiritual journey themselves. Obviously, when my children ask me questions about Islam or what I believe, I answer their questions. I don't push anything on them. I encourage them to read and to think and to reflect and to question everything, not just take things on board without questioning. And hopefully they will find a good way going forward. I mean,
If they connected more with Christianity in like around the age of 20, like you did with Islam, how would you feel about that?
it's their own spiritual journey. I mean, the thing is, some parents, they send their children to madrasa or, Sunday mosque classes, and, they recite the Quran in Arabic, and then they don't understand anything. Some of them even completely drift away from religion completely, and not just religion. In some cases, they drift away from an ethical and moral framework for their life, which I find even more troubling. I mean, if somebody is a Christian or a Buddhist or a Jew, um, whether they're semi-practicing or quite practicing, they have like an ethical or moral framework. Um, it's not exclusive to religious people. They're also, I mean, I've got atheist friends as well that, they're philosophical and they also have an ethical and moral framework. It does trouble me though when people don't have that at all. And I think and religious people, as we've just been discussing, there's some religious people who don't seem to have much of an ethical or moral framework. But when you don't have that within a society and you suddenly start to get a lot of people like that, it does create a lot of problems.
So do you think then, in terms of, your message being uh, quite different from that of many other Muslim leaders, and do you think there is a crisis of leadership within Islam, specifically in British Islam, but not just, and in that battle, effectively, because it is a battle, who do you see as coming out on top?
Well, I certainly hope we do, but obviously it's a long way to go. I mean, this is why we actually set up something called ICRA, the International Quran Research Association, with Dr. Safi Kaskas from the United States, who translated the Quran and brought together Quran translators, both Muslim and also people who weren't Muslim who translated the Quran, but were scholars of the book, to actually come together to actually firstly analyze the Quran and to find a better understanding of it that is also relevant for the times in which we live, to make sure we've understood it in the best way, but also to educate people and to develop a new generation of scholars. And that is not the only people I'm working with either, but we need to actually address this crisis of ignorance. And that is what I see as the real problem here, because why are people also drawn into extremism? If people understand even basic tenets of Islam about how we should be as human beings in relation to God, in relation to other people, it's impossible to be an extremist because you have to respect every human being. And this is actually part of Islam that just classical Muslims understand. If people are lacking this, of course they can be drawn into extremism. Of course they can be drawn into all sorts of things that they shouldn't be. People who are reciting the book in Arabic and are unaware in many cases of the many other texts that have been written, uh, even books of hadith, but not just that, but the books of scholars over the generations, books by Imam al-Ghazali or books by Ibn Arabi and people like this. It's not widely read. It's not widely understood. one of the things that the Prophet Muhammad himself struggled against in his time was ignorance. The actual time before Islam is called the Jahiliyyah, which means the time of ignorance. Now what I see within Muslim communities is that we are living in a time of ignorance. So people calling themselves Muslims, but are very ignorant.
So can you see how calling the time before Islam the time of ignorance might be a bit offensive to Jews?
Well, he wasn't calling the Jews ignorant, particularly. It was the time. I mean, the context of it was the pagan Arabs. I mean, later on he met more Jews when he went to Medina, and like I said, the Constitution of Medina, where the Prophet Muhammad actually wrote that and says that you have your religion and we have our religion. We are one ummah, and I think that's an interesting point as well, because you get these.
Were the Jews not banished from Medina?
Not all of them. There were certain tribes, but this was a tribal conflict. It wasn't about them being Jewish.
How many is reasonable?
Well, look, we don't really want to go into that. It's like it's a complicated thing. The best person to talk to on this is actually Professor Joel Haywood, who's actually analyzed this in detail, and all of the battles and stuff in the early days of Islam and how that has been greatly misunderstood. And I don't want to step on his toes because he's far more of an expert on it than me. But also, interestingly, there's a Jewish rabbi called Reuben Firestone who's also written about this, and I like his analysis of the whole situation. And he too highlighted it wasn't about them being Jews. This was about conflict between different communities that were there. And, it wasn't about the faith so much or the beliefs of them. It was, and where those conflicts didn't erupt, they were fine living side by side. So, but the point is, in the actual Constitution of Medina itself, the Prophet Muhammad said this, and the initial signing on to it. I mean, people make an agreement. Sometimes agreements work, sometimes they don't. Some of those tribes broke away from it. Others kept to that agreement. But in that agreement, the wording is, he mentioned the names of the tribes, and he says, you have your religion and we have our religion, but we are one ummah. The reason I'm emphasizing this is because you get the extremist groups, they talk today about a Muslim ummah. This was clearly not the concept of the Prophet Muhammad, who was talking about an ummah that included Jewish, he didn't use the word citizens because it didn't exist at the time, but effectively Jewish citizens, pagan citizens, who actually signed onto that constitution. And, according to those principles that they had mutually agreed between them, and they were citizens. They were equals within that state. Now, I'm aware later on there were other societies that wasn't always the case. But the point is, the Prophet clearly attempted this and worked towards this. And it's something I deeply rate him for, because it was unusual. It's unusual for a religious leader to do that. It's unusual for many leaders to do that as well, not even religious leaders.
So you know how in Israel now there is freedom of worship for Muslims, for example. There are mosques, there's the muezzin. When I'm in Tel Aviv, I hear literally the call to prayer from the window where I sleep in the morning. Where are the Jews of Medina today?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we all know after the creation of Israel, there were political tensions around the Muslim world, and some of those societies, the way they responded, I regard it as un-Islamic, because Jews have been living in these societies for centuries, millennia even, and were well established there. And in some societies, they were expelled. That I disagree with profoundly. It should never have happened. But it also didn't happen in every case. It didn't happen in Turkey. It didn't happen in Morocco. So clearly there were Muslims that understood things on a similar lines to how I understand it, and didn't think that that was the right thing to do. But there were others that they did something that I think was terrible, wrong, un-Islamic. By whichever assessment we regard it, it should never have happened.
But would you like then to see Jews back in Medina and Mecca?
Why not? Why not? I prefer when people live together. I like the way in the UAE they've built the House of Abraham.
Yes, it's beautiful that they've got the three places.
That's, I think, a model that we should be moving towards. Why don't we have that in more places?
When you hear chants like Kaiba Kaiba Ya Yahud, the army of Muhammad going,
It's ignorance. This is like, why
what
are
does it
we
refer to?
focusing on that? Well, I'm aware of what it focuses on and the conflicts that happen between those particular tribes and the Prophet Muhammad's community. But the thing is, why are they saying that? I've never said this myself. I wouldn't say that. I don't want to create hatred between communities. It's why in the 21st century, these political instances, what happened at that time where people broke their agreements, it was about those particular communities that broke their agreements. This was a political situation in a particular context. This was not universal throughout the history of Muslims and Jews when they lived side by side. There were good examples.
What about the jizya?
And there were bad examples. The jizya is a tax that is paid by people who are Muslims, and it's supposed to mirror the zakat that is paid by Muslims. So it's supposed to be balanced. But of course, what happened is you had some leaders, they decided, okay, well, let's take more from them. And I believe that's a twisting of what the initial intention was.
If it's a mirror of the zakat, how much is that? 10% or more? I don't know. In Judaism, we have a 10%. But if it's a mirror,
It's actually only 2.5%, but it varies.
you get off lightly.
Yeah, it depends on like what kind of business. There are actually 2.5% is a general thing, but if you've got certain assets and stuff, it has to be calculated.
Okay.
I don't really want to go into all
No,
of
no,
that.
fair enough. If it were equal, as I understand your reading is, the jizya and the zakat, what was it used for?
Well, it's supposed to be used for, part of it is for like the defense of the state, but also most of it's supposed to go towards like people who are vulnerable and, need like if they can't feed themselves or they can't look after themselves, and it's supposed to go for that sort of thing. So, I mean, every society needs to have something in place like that. Otherwise, there are going to be people who are left behind. I mean, these are things that should be done in a responsible way. And just like we have in this country, we have a benefit system, we have the NHS, we have certain things in place to help people who are more vulnerable in society who can't look after themselves on their current income. I mean, it's good that that exists within Islam. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I believe the jizya was supposed to be a balance of that with people from other communities.
And what are the concept of dhimmis?
That's a good question. And I mean, dhimmi is someone who is like a citizen within the Muslim state, but they are of another faith. They have certain rights and responsibilities. I mean, the other thing is about these things is, bearing in mind, these were put in place 1400 years ago. In Christian Europe, they didn't have things like this in place. And people who were not, Catholics, for instance, at that time, were incredibly persecuted. So the fact that Islam had this in place from the outset, that was initially supposed to be a protection and allow them the place within society and the freedom of religion and stuff, I know it didn't always work as it should have done, but clearly this was a good thing that something was put in place.
And is it
And
relevant
in
now, though?
some cases it worked better than in others. Obviously, in the modern world, in fact, Nahdlatul Ulama actually did what I believe is the right approach to this. They actually said that we should expunge from our language the concept of kafir. We shouldn't use it anymore. In modern societies, regardless of what people are, what religion people are, or what they believe, people are citizens. Their relationship with each other and the relationship with the state is as citizens. And as citizens, we have rights and responsibilities. That is enough. We don't need to go into that anymore. And I believe this modern concept of citizenship, it kind of trumps all of that. That's something that we should try to understand what its initial purpose was, and obviously look at the history. But we are living in the 21st century today, and things have moved on.
But Islam is, in a sense, political, isn't it?
There's a political aspect to every religion. I mean, there's certain things that we believe. It's like, I believe people should be cared for, who can't look after themselves. That aspect of social justice, that is a political thing.
Right. Under Islam, some of the rules, as I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong. For example, people should be looked after, but the rules about widows and women and inheritance for women, it's not what people today in Britain would necessarily consider looking after them. It's not equal. It's not equitable. Women don't get as big a share, things like that.
But the thing is, these things were put in place from in many cases, a total absence of it.
But are they still in place in Islam?
Well, we should look for the best possible way forward. And this is an Islamic principle, to look at the things, look for the best possible way ahead. If there's something better, if there's an improvement that comes into society, into people's thinking, into policy, we should use that. We shouldn't abandon that because of something that was written 1400 years
Here's
ago.
my question then. So I was discussing this recently with a rabbi, that in Judaism there are certain laws which feel difficult and almost wrong in their restrictiveness. And that the problem, even with reinterpreting them in order to make them more amenable today, is that since there is no Sanhedrin, there are no judges, something that Jews pray for every day in the Amidah prayers, a return to our judges, maybe we have them again, because then we can change the law appropriately. So, for example, one example is to do with homosexuality. Certain acts are forbidden, and even the most favorable or liberal of Orthodox rabbis, however much they want, can't get around that fact because it was set by the Sanhedrin. We don't have that anymore. So that's that. Other rules, they can find loopholes and precedents that enable them to do it. In Islam, my understanding is that sort of thing isn't possible, is it? You can't.
Well, it is because, scholars can actually, reassess things according to the time and place. There is actually one thing that people don't understand with Sharia is that there's an aspect of it which is whatever the societal situation is, the cultural aspect of it, that has to be taken into account. And this is why the way Islam developed in Morocco was different to the way it developed in Turkey, the way it developed in Indonesia, because the scholars that went to those places, they looked at the local cultural context. This is again something that due to ignorance has kind of slipped back, and this is causing problems for Muslims today. We need to go back to that. Islam in Britain is like something you mentioned before earlier. Do I believe that there should be a British Islam? In a sense, yes, and in a sense, no. What I mean by that is I don't think it's separate from Islam to have a British implementation of Islam, because we have to take into account the culture of the United Kingdom, the way we do things here. And if there are things within British society that make more sense, that are more practical, that are more equitable, bearing in mind that the principle of justice is a principle within the Quran, and we should be moving towards justice. If we had something that was less just and we have a better solution, we should be moving towards justice. This is a Quranic and Islamic principle that we should be implementing. So if there are things already within British society that are better, that are more advanced than what was available 1400 years ago, of course we should work with that and adopt that. And there's no reason why scholars of Islam can't come together and do that. And in fact, in many cases, they have.
I find your outlook very encouraging and very promising because it enables me as a non-Muslim who has certain fears to imagine a world in which this relatively young religion is able to continue to develop in your direction rather than the direction that blew up the Twin Towers or crossed the border on the 7th of October or blew up Manchester Arena, or the list is long. And I do hope for that. So I suppose in closing, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. I'm sorry if it's felt like a grilling at times, but for me, it's so important to be able to hear from people like you. If you were a Jew in Britain today, like me, and you met somebody like you who has these visions and this understanding and this reading of Islam, and you hope with all your heart that that's going to prevail in Islam, become the mainstream, would you still think it was likely enough to relax, feel less afraid? Or would you worry that actually the very reasonable Sheikh Armstrong is going to get killed along with the rest of us for these heretical beliefs that some people think set him out as an apostate?
Well, I'm a Muslim, and as a Muslim, I'm concerned about these things. So we shouldn't sit back and relax. It's complacency is what allows these problems to happen in the first place. If this society had been less complacent in the first place, we wouldn't even be having this conversation, certainly within the British context. It was complacency that allowed this to happen. I remember some years ago, I was actually in a meeting with, the meeting was for something else, but there was a lady who was there who was an officer from the counter-terrorism unit of the West Midlands Police. And she said to me, she says, after this meeting, can I talk to you about something else? There's something which is bothering me. And I want to talk to you. I want to get your opinion on it. So, of course, I said, yeah, sure, no problem. And afterwards, this was well before anything appeared in the media on this or before any arrests had been made. She asked me, she said, we know about certain people within the Muslim community who, she says, I'm sorry to say this, she said, but they are abusing young girls. They are raping them and getting them into prostitution. And of course, I was horrified when I heard this. I'm like, what? And I said, seriously? I said, do you have evidence on these people? She says, yeah. I said, why are they? I said, have you arrested them? No, because we're scared of what the backlash would be. I said, why haven't you arrested them? I said, they are committing crimes. You have evidence on them. I said, this is unacceptable, even from a Muslim perspective. I said, and she said, but what about what the Muslims say? I said, actually, I said, you know what? I said, if we had the kind of Sharia that you think Sharia should, is, I said, these people would be executed. I said, I mean, obviously that's old-fashioned kind of, but if it like what the Ottomans or something had, So I said, why haven't you arrested them? I mean, since then, I found out that this situation has gone on for decades.
What do you think would have happened if they gone and arrested those people? Or what do you think would happen if they went into extremist mosques and arrested the imams who are preaching against Jews?
If you just take that situation, I mean, my dad actually had a sister who, when she was about 15 years old, she disappeared. She went missing. They found that she was in Manchester, and when she came back, she was pregnant. She had a child that she said was Italian. My dad said, after talking to his sister and stuff, he reckoned that the child was actually Asian. I didn't think about this for many years until like all of this happened, and I thought, has it been going on since then? Imagine if when it was back then and there was only certain cases and it was a small number of people affected, those people had been arrested and an example had been made. We wouldn't have seen everything that happened afterwards. Why didn't the police do their job? They are there to protect us in this society. They are there to enforce the law. These people were clearly breaking laws, and those laws existed back in the 1960s. So why didn't they do the job?
Do you understand people who want to support your bold and brave vision of Islam, non-Muslims who want to support that, being concerned that doing so might just recast in everyone else's minds Islam as a religion of peace, of love, of no threat to us, and that in turn that might backfire?
It's an interesting perspective. I haven't really thought about it that way, but no one's put it to me that way before. So I don't know really how to respond to that, but it's certainly there is a problem with complacency. We mustn't be complacent. When we see any kind of extremism within society, when we see crimes that are taking place that shouldn't be taking place, these things need to be addressed. And if they were addressed early on, then they don't become the huge issues that we're now facing as a society.
Sheikh Paul Salahuddin Armstrong, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been so informative, and I hope that people watching also found it so. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you as well.